Welcome, beloved, to the Tending the Roots podcast, where we explore the frontier lands of new culture creation. I'm your sometimes host, Kareen Bell, and along with the co-dreamers and friends of the Rooted Global Village, we'll be in conversation, exploration, and play with changemakers, scholar activists, and teachers dedicated to culture change work and seeding futures.
For us to be granting one another that kind of support, we also have to have trust. And we create that trust through adherence or conformity to a relatively rigid set of behavioral or moral codes. And we check each other for adherence to those moral codes as well.
I feel like you are such a leader in so many ways. And I have experienced you very much kind of pioneering, synthesized ideas and really blending them with your own experience. And what comes out is so profound to me. And I wonder, what is leadership, first of all? What does it mean to be a leader in relationship, in community?
Oh, these are like deep, like a soul perceiving questions, right? Am I a leader? I have so many answers to that question. Can I just indulge myself in a ramble? Is that okay?
Yes, right. Yes, you may. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I guess I have two parallel thought tracks that sort of interweave at some point with this. And the first is I didn't want to be a leader. And leaders are so often in the dominant culture and also in other cultures like subcultural or non-European colonial cultures. Leader is so often the person with power over, the person who can make you do something because they have the power to punish. And I think about this so much, what are the dynamics of that? In whatever way the village or the citadel or the community anoints the leader, especially in a democratic process. But, even non-democratically, there's this kind of shared belief that a leader is given the power to legitimately enact force upon other human beings in order to get things done, in order to move the way. And that's not the kind of leader you and I are, because we actually don't have, we're not CEOs, or we're not military leaders. We don't have that. Maybe we do have power to damage and to harm for sure, but it's a softer kind of damage and harm if we do that. The power of leadership that we are talking about is really this sort of intangible quality of shining. Other people are drawn to what we say and what we do, and then take that as a model for what we should say and what we should do, which is terrifying because it's did we want that? Is it good if we want that? What if we say something wrong? All of that sort of thing. And I didn't ask for that. I think what I was asking for early on was an audience. I wanted to be an artist, a writer. It's so funny that I'm not actually really that well known solely as a writer. People think of me as a thought leader who writes. And I also don't like that term, thought leader. And so I've had to think a lot, what is that quality of shiningness? And we were just talking about all these kind of people, cultural leaders, thought leaders who are getting together. I think, Resmaa, Bayo Komolafe, in a totally different sphere, but connected, Brené Brown. There's so many people like this now who the things we do and say are taken as the model. And, before the rise of the wellness influencer, because let's just be real, in some ways that is what we are, or the activist influencer, but the confluence, somatics, that's the confluence of activism and wellness influencership. There was the priest class, right, in various societies, and the priests were, given or ordained the power of God to see the vision in the flames or whatever, right, or in the sky, wherever your particular priests get their visions from. And I think what's really dangerous and exciting about being a leader, a thought leader, activist, influencer, is that our visions do not necessarily come from a preordained divine. They come from within, or they come from a personal divine, or they're kind of eclectically driven. But people are in search of a vision. They're always in search of a vision. because they don't believe that they can generate that vision on their own, or they authentically can't. And I think this is the important thing about the one who shines. Like, we have to know, even if the people who follow us don't believe that they can have the vision of their own, they can. And even if they choose, right? Like, we should always be returning them to their internal sense. You were asking earlier before we started recording, like, an important question is like, can I dissent in this space? And if you can't, I think that's a big fucking problem. Like, I'm really not okay with leaders who, in whatever way, kind of like imply or state you cannot dissent with what they say. Because what they're saying is, I am the one ordained. I have the vision from the divine, and you don't. And actually, I am so opposed to that.
Sounds like it's more like an accompaniment. Paulo Freire is famous for it, for articulating this idea, like in the banking model of education kind of idea of, you are the empty vessel. I'm here to fill you with knowledge that you don't have. And that's something that I think we're, in many of these spaces, we're either replicating unknowingly, or we're inviting people into I think, into a relationship. I was thinking a lot about the nervous system and the state that we're in that leaves us more susceptible to certain forms of leadership. So I was just thinking, like, if there's a zombie apocalypse tomorrow,
oh gosh,
who are we going to follow? I'm going to follow the person who's like, I know where to go. I know where there's good food. I know, but this is a crisis. This is the state of creation in crisis. And I think what we're trying to do, for example, what we're trying to do in Rooted is something very different. And it's kind of a cultivation, which has to do with how do we begin to shift out of these survival states, and the way we then orient around leaders and ideas from a state of survival, which makes a lot of sense. Of course, if we're in that state, it makes a lot of sense to orient in that way. But how do we begin to invite people into another relationship with their own power?
Oh, I mean, you're singing my song. And actually, I just want to say thank you, because as you were speaking about what you're doing in Rooted, it actually, I resolved something I've been thinking about a lot for the past few weeks. So I think about the metaphor of the village, which I know you do too, because it's Rooted Global Village, and in the village, the archetypal mode that we know from dominant culture, maybe other cultures, is like, there's like the leader in the village, and then everyone else follows, and then maybe there's like a practical leader, and then there's a spiritual leader, maybe, right? And the spiritual leader is telling everybody like how to be in right relationship with spirit. But as you were speaking, I was like, right, like, what if we lived in a village where everyone was like the priest or priestess of like their own home, right? Like, everyone cultivates a spiritual knowledge, and they don't come to the temple to receive the download model of education, from the pulpit, or like, maybe it's like a rotating cast of people who are like doing the sermon or leading the whatever, and I think about, we're sort of in the zombie apocalypse of like, it is a climate crisis apocalypse, and it is it has been the colonial apocalypse for indigenous peoples and like Black enslaved peoples for a long time now, so I think often what has happened in a subtle way, really subtle, less like kind of crude than the metaphor, is like, sometimes like the liberation leaders emerge, especially now. I think there's something about the wellness influencership that's really like corruptive. But I think sometimes our leaders emerge, and we want them to tell us how to fix like the crises of like social injustice, their moral crises. And so we want them to tell us, and they also want to tell us. And like, rules and like rigidity are so valued. Like, I think I feel complex even saying this, right? Like, because who doesn't want to like, well, I mean, for me, I want to go to a seminar by like Robin DiAngelo or like Ibram X. Kendi or whatever, and like, I want to listen, and I do want to receive, actually. But I think it's really key for us to know that like those people are just people. Brene Brown is just a person. Reza Menachem is just a person. Corinne Bell and Cheng Thom are just people. Like they can come and listen to what we have to say. And then actually it's not only that they can dissent, it's their job to like critically evaluate what we are saying. And I think it's very hard for our followers to do that when we as leaders aren't constantly reminding the crowd, right? Like the village punishes dissenters in its midst. And sometimes our protocols encourage the village to punish dissenters in their midst. And I think we really need to encourage the village to respond to dissent in a different way.
I think that there is a tendency, especially in the US-centric framework, kind of either like hyper independence or cult. You know?
Yes, it's one or the other. Yeah.
What does it mean to be an individual, Cheng Thom, Corinne Bell, within a collective of other bodies, especially in the kinds of landscapes that we're navigating? And I think about this a lot, where on one hand, we don't need each other. You know what I mean? Like,
not in a
for the most part. And this is a generalization. I want to say that I think that there are exceptions to this for sure. But I mean, from the standpoint of there are particular structures in place that mediate our relationship, where my everyday survival I don't see it as necessarily tied to yours.
I mean, there's so many things. I think the first thing I think about is like, oh yeah, do I rely on my villages, whatever they are, for survival? And I mean, on a day-to-day, like physical material level, like no, because I go to the grocery store and like buy my things, like whatever. Like there's some social support in Canada, but but then on the other hand, yes. And I was actually just writing an essay about this, like why being called out or canceled for trans women of color is often like a really intense social death sentence, and also sometimes a real death sentence, where it's not for like a white Hollywood movie star, because in that particular axis of my marginalization. I will say that's also not true for me being Chinese right now, although it was, I think, when my parents were living in Chinatown and stuff, which is a village, right? Like Chinatown is a literal village inside of a city. But like, I lived in gay villages for a long time, like queer villages. I did until like 2 years ago. Like I'd spent maybe 14 years living in queer villages in Montreal and Toronto. And like the truth is, for most of us who are trans women, this isn't true for all queer people anymore. It never was true for all queer people, but it was for most out queer people, as you may know, for a long time. Like if you were out, you couldn't be employed, and if you're a trans woman today, it's actually really hard to be in sustained long-term employment. That's why so many of us are like, you go into like modeling or sex work or like something where you're kind of like running your own business. And that's what I do, right? Like run my own business, and my financial well-being and my social well-being is really predicated on like social currency that like moves through like interconnected small loops of queer people. And were I to have my reputation damaged in like a serious enough way, I would lose access to that. And I might not die, but although I also might die, like my life would become substantially materially harder. And I think the thing that has happened also for me and for some people in those kind of like queer social loops, like those little villages of the heart or whatever, right? Like is that social currency is interacted with in a capitalist model. Like, I have a certain number of followers and I have a certain amount of popularity and my voice is really heard. And so that makes it harder for me to be discarded, but not impossible. And then also makes it easier in certain ways because I'm hypervisible, But I think that's something that's happening is we do live in villages, some of us as marginalized people. The popularity is the currency, the social currency, and then we treat it like capital. And like, maybe one of the questions we're sort of asking is like, what is a different model of social currency? Like, how can we share and let it flow in a way that isn't about accumulating and hoarding over other people?
Yeah.
And social media encourages it, like, because you can count the actual numbers, like of how many followers or likes or whatever people have. I think that we model our social currency off the rapacious, like economic context that we are, for the most part, born into now and inculcated in. We don't know how to do it any other way. We don't know how to live without. It's like yeah, you can either be in a cult or hyper independent. Hyper independence is death for lots of marginalized people, so you have to be in the cult. And then it's like, why does it need to be a cult? Like, where did that modeling come from? Right? Is it the Christian church? Is it the divine right of kings? Like, I'm really serious, right? Like, where is that model coming from? Why aren't we in like a multi-leadership kind of paradigm?
I had an experience many years ago. There was a church that I frequented on the south side of Chicago for a period of time, and there was a lot of economic instability in this part of the city. But then there was this church, and this church had 22,000 members at the time. It had this tiny little church building, could only hold about 300 people of the 22,000. They had like a spillover gym, but they were a powerful force in the community, right?
Oh, yeah.
They got shit done. The interesting thing, and I couldn't stay there longer than I did. I loved being there. And yet there was a barrier for me because I wasn't a believer. It was more of the rigidity of identity that I found so interesting. But when I juxtaposed that to the environment, the conditions out of which this coherence had to come, they created a village, but it was against the backdrop of kind of the anti-village.
Yeah, there's the village, and there's the woods, there's the wilderness, right? And the wilderness is cruel. And I think like the village, it's so interesting thinking about village, like how we create these communities, right? Like they're so giving, like even I'm talking about these like kind of like loosely, mostly online now, like kind of queer closed loops. I mean, as you were talking about this, I'm like, yeah, actually I am part of like online and also real life here in Toronto and Montreal and Canada networks where, like, if you are looking for a home and you can't find one, you're queer, you can put that out there and people will help you find one. You can say, I need $1,200 for my rent, and people will fundraise $1,200 for your rent. Like, we will do that. Like, it's because we need to, right? And yeah, no, I have no doubt. Like, people ask me for things. I used to be a social worker, and there was like there were several youth who were like, I need this money. And I would like kind of put the word out and like the money would appear, like you couldn't do it repeatedly over and over, but like you could get your needs met. It wasn't amazing because, of course, it's like a stopgap, right? Like you don't always want to be asking for one thing after another. You want like a sustainable lifestyle, whatever. But we have some version of that. I think what's really interesting in both the kind of like the church you're talking about and the kind of community I'm talking about, though, is that it's almost like a corollary or a condition for us to be granting one another that kind of support. We also have to have trust, and we create that trust through like adherence or conformity to a relatively rigid set of behavioral or moral codes. And we check each other for adherence to those moral codes as well. Like, maybe it's a casual question, like, what have you let Jesus into your life, right? Or like, people will ask in queer community, like, oh, like, what's that person's politics, and they are pointed, like the aunties are always asking the question about like, what is the virtue of that person? Even if the moral codes are different between the Baptist church and like, a rad queer community in an urban area, we're always checking, because then we can say, oh, that person's good. That person's good. They deserve the help. Or we can trust this person's word. They deserve the help. And I don't really know how to get out of that. Like, how can we, the question is like, can we have the support without the rigidity? I think the answer must be yes, but then you have to create trust in another way.
Mm-hmm. When I think about Rooted, I often talk about how we don't have any fixed coordinates. There's no map. In fact, in some ways, we're trying to go off map, off maps. There's no destination that we know of, but we're not without a navigation system. There are most certainly values that I think form that navigation system. What are the values that we hold that become our kind of compass points along the way? So this becomes like the next right step, because this is where we're being guided, because this is what aligns with the ethos that we're moving from, or the values that we hold, right? But it's a different way of navigating the world. It doesn't have rigid ideas about what things are. Things can be kind of fuzzy in that sense. There might be a fog, like hanging over the water. We might not be able to see very clearly. Does that make sense? It's like
completely.
Yeah.
No, I love that. This is the village I want to live in, right? Like where we're okay with the emergence and we're bringing in new stuff. Like I think there's also something about the stagnation, like where we refuse to let in other like new ideas. And you see that a lot with churches, and you see it a lot for community too, actually. Like, and there's always like someone to blame, like churches blame lots of people, sexually free people, unmarried people, like queer people. And then I noticed even queer people, like, there was a whole trend, and there still is in some ways, of like, not trusting bisexuals because they're kind of straight, like that's a biphobic idea, of course, but like, that's a real thing that people have said, and they said it a lot in the 90s, particularly, it's not good. There's always, like trying to embrace the fog. And of course the rubber hits the road. We come back to one of my favorite topics, which is conflict, right? Like rubber hits the road when it comes to conflict. Because like the stakes are big. Like I think about some of the big topics that you and I interact with in our work as, thought people. And, anti-racism is one of them. People have thoughts and then put them in the public. I notice, like, for example, especially in American spaces, I have to say as a non-American, I really see it in American-driven spaces. Like, you walk into an American racial justice space and people want to know the rules, and they want to have them written down, like, on the wall. Like, what happens if we're in conflict, like, with a person of color is in conflict with a white person? And then people want is, like, a really strict set of rules about how the white person is going to behave and how the person of color is going to behave, more the white person in this case, in racial justice spaces. And what happens if we embrace emergence and authenticity, and a white person looks within themselves and says, actually, my authentic feeling is that this microaggressive joke I made is okay. What then, right? Or like with queer and trans people, like what happens if, and this has happened to me a lot as a mediator, what happens if a person of color looks into themselves and says, it's not within my culture to accept or to use the pronouns for trans people that they're asking me to use, and that feels colonial to me, which is actually something people have said to me a large number of times, right? Like
I've heard that too.
Oh yeah, it's a very common thing. I don't agree with that. I mean, you could talk about how European colonization erased, gender diversity in many cultures. But what I mean to say is, like, if we tap into our, deep internal truths, and we find out that some of our deep internal truths are in conflict with other people in the village, it's not so easy to embrace the fog, but I think we have to.
I love everything you just said. And, during this retreat that we had with the Rooted folks, and I have to say, a lot of things have happened in Rooted, but maybe not those things that you named, those right. Potentialities. I would be so intrigued. I'm not asking universe, by the way.
Tomorrow something happens, you're calling it in. We're just gonna,
maybe I could witness in another space how somebody did that. But I said it already. But we were sitting around and we all kind of generated some of the values that we either hold or have seen and Rooted or aspire to, et cetera. And I think almost all of us had some variation of the word invitation. It reminds me, do you know this quote by Adrienne Rich? I'm curious what you think about this, but related to this idea of invitation and what it means to invite people, because I think at some level, I feel like what we're, the essence of what we're trying to do in Rooted is to try to find our way back into relationship, like tending a relational field, like almost before anything else. I've stopped calling Rooted a community very early on, because I saw all of the ways that evokes a very certain understanding. And maybe just speaking to this whole conversation we were having, like there's a whole lot of assumptions we might come to a space with if it's being called a community.
Totally.
Like, well, communities do this. Communities are supposed to be like that. Communities are whatever it might be. And I started talking about Anat Singh in the book, The Mushroom at the End of the World. She talks about the precarity of assemblages. And she's talking about it from like an interspecies kind of collaborative survival standpoint, but it really resonated with me in terms of what we're trying to do, like finding each other in relationship in the kind of disturbed landscape of coloniality. What does it mean to find our way back into it? And when I think about the term invitation, I think about all of the layers of relational wounding that we're coming into a space with, and they're going to be different for different bodies. And then what does it mean to actually begin to attempt to build some intimacy and trust in that space? And where do we get to the point where someone can say that thing, right? And then we can work with it, right? Like that is the fog. You're literally in the fog in that moment. You maybe have no experience of ever navigating a moment like that, where we can kind of suspend even for a moment this idea that there is one way to respond to that thing and consider that we don't know yet. But I don't want it to be something we just blow past. But we maybe need some time to like consider it, because that's part of the problem. We don't have a lot of spaces where we can even stay with the question long enough to even deepen in our own understanding of what just happened, or like what our response might be. Does that make sense?
Oh, it's complete sense.
There's something about that going the hard way together that really resonates with me. Maybe it's because I'm a slow processor too. Like if, it can take me time to metabolize things when they happen. And in a culture that seems, and I'm talking mainly about the US right now, it has a very prescripted understanding of like what should happen next and the protocol for the thing, how to respond to it. I struggle with it, especially in social justice spaces. Some of those spaces, and it's inherent to the idea of social justice.
I think
it's part of this thing that you're talking about, like this kind of a coherence to like a very particular moral code. What did you say? Like moral these are the things we do. These are the things we say. And there's this kind of an assumption that's how we're going to respond as things come up, or that's how we're going to even move together or think together. There doesn't seem to be a lot of room for any dissenting thought or any question, or even the questions that want to arise in that space. And how do we do that?
Yeah, I really resonate with that. I think that's a brave thing to say, and I want to say it with you.
I'm scared. And just as I said it, I got scared.
Isn't that interesting? Like, as soon as we say, basically what you said is like, we have some very strict codes in lots of social justice spaces, and I wish we didn't. Fear enters the body, and like that tells us a lot of things, it tells us about the tenor of the villages we live in. It tells us about, and I mean, this is the important thing that I do want listeners to hear, right? Is like, we have the moral codes for a real reason, right? The wilderness outside the village has been, continues to be violent and terrifying. And we think if we adhere, we'll be safe. We are also wrong about that in a lot of ways. Like when we are rigid, we are not safe. Rigidity creates danger for us in a new way. And I think what you're saying is like actually the slowness of letting emergence and uncertainty unfold offers us a whole other possibility. And then I think, the plea, right? Like what I think I am imploring people, maybe you are as well, I don't know, like the request is like, but people who are in the villages who, who choose to be with us, nobody has to choose to be with us. That's the other important thing, right? Like who choose to be with us, that we try, like that we forego, at least for a while, like what feels like the comforting certainty of clear rules, for like perhaps like a more authentic way of being, which is like when someone says a microaggressive joke and then does not get why that's like not funny, or like when someone says they won't use my pronouns and they won't change, right? And they say it's about culture, right? That we don't default to you must change or we'll kick you out.
Right.
But we're like, oh, okay, let's like sit down for a while and see what happens. Mm-hmm. And that's a big ask. I just think that we're asking because we believe that the reward on the other side is bigger.
Yeah. Yes. 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 I think that's it. I really think that's it. I also just want to maybe just end on one little note, which is, this can also, because these spaces, liberatory, I'm not going to say social justice spaces can feel very, there's also this idea, I think sometimes that we can't find our way with joy.
Yeah, it should be fun.
And play and pleasure and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
We know this. I know you know this. I know Adrienne Marie Brown knows it. I know like this is a thing. I know Audre Lorde knows it. I mean, this is not new. My daughter's in circ school right now and she's having a blast. Anyway, I went to pick her up and the teacher was talking about how in the circus or like in clowning, the magic number is 3. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Because bio is always talking about that the number 3 is like the trickster number. I think that there is this kind of playful disruption of like the unsettling of these very rigid. I don't know if you probably weren't there. We had some friends of ours, the Pandemic Players, they're called. It's a group of 4 people, and they do like this kind of performative, like improv theater. Anyway, we did these rigid Tinder profiles together. We were in it like
that's so fun.
It was amazing because like you got to play with all of the ways that your rigid self might show up in a space, and of course, so much compassion for what that rigid self has been doing for you in your life and sometimes still needs to do. And can we play with it here? You know, can we disrupt it and shake it up like a snow globe? And then it was so much fun.
Oh my God. And like, you lovingly caricature, like, the part of us that needs other people to follow rules. Like,
That's right. That's it. And with a little play, we shake it up.
Thank you for joining us today. We don't take for granted what it means to dedicate your time and energy to us, so thank you for listening. And if you're curious to learn more about what we get up to in Rooted, check out rootedglobalvillage.com or follow us on Instagram at tending.the.roots. Be well.